So far in this series, we've heard Voddie present two common arguments for the Bible and for Jesus' resurrection. One is Paul's 500 eyewitnesses, and the other is the number of New Testament manuscripts. So let's see what he has to offer us today.
When it comes to the New Testament, we have 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts for the New Testament. Folks, that's not even close. Well, you don't have the originals. No, we really don't. But guess what? We can get earlier than AD 120 with some of the copies that we have. When it comes to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, the earliest thing we can put our hands on was written 900 years after the original. But nobody's tearing down the walls in college because they're reading Caesar. When it comes to Aristotle, the earliest thing we can put our hands on was written 1,400 years after the original. But when it comes to the New Testament, we can put our hands on documents that were written within decades of the originals.
All right, so his next point is pretty clear. The New Testament is reliable not only because of the number of manuscripts we have, but because these manuscripts date so close to the time of Christ. To make this point, he slips in a cleverly phrased statement that implies we have multiple complete copies of the New Testament that date earlier than the year 120.
Guess what? We can get earlier than AD 120 with some of the copies that we have.
If you look at his exact words, he very directly claims there are multiple documents and that they date back before 120. And while he doesn't explicitly state that these are complete New Testaments, his phrasing leaves little doubt that this is the conclusion he was trying to lead his congregation to. But whatever Voddie's intention, it's important that Christians realize that none of this is anywhere close to true. The earliest New Testament document we have is a credit card-sized scrap called P52, which includes the following text. Now, while we can see that these words are part of Jesus' encounter with Pilate in the book of John, and thus infer an early date to that particular story, the text itself is unintelligible, and this document contains basically no information. But even this humble little scrap, the oldest New Testament document we have, comes from after, not before, the year 120. The most generous date ever given to it extends as far back as the year 100, but most modern scholarship places it between the years 125 and 175, and there's some question about whether it may have been produced later than the year 200. So when Voddie confidently states that we have copies of the New Testament dating before 120, he's either flat lying or he doesn't even know the basics of the New Testament's textual history. But the deeper problem is that there just isn't a good argument here, regardless of whether Voddie is right or wrong about the texts. Even if there were copies of the New Testament dating to, say, AD 100 or even earlier, all he would have proven is that Christians were remarkably quick to produce a body of religious text and that they were fastidious about copying and preserving them. There's no reason whatsoever to jump from this observation to a conclusion that the supernatural events within those texts actually happen. What's more, no Christian would ever make such a leap, at least not toward anything other than Christianity. For example, let's imagine we discovered an isolated Himalayan religious group that claimed its founding patriarch was God, and imagine this society had a collection of 100,000 documents dating to just 50 years from that man's death, with stories of how he performed miracles, wowed everybody with his wisdom, and was raised from the dead. This is far better manuscript attestation than Christianity has, right? So would Christians jump in head first like a bunch of hard-boiled Lee Strobels to investigate? And once they had verified the body of textual evidence, would they conclude that this man was God and convert to this tribe's religion? You can bet your ass they would not. In fact, I can guarantee they would come up with all kinds of perfectly rational explanations for how a devout society could have produced these documents based on legend and legend alone. Number and age of religious texts could never convince a Christian to convert to another religion, just as number and age of religious texts never convinced them to become Christian in the first place. They're just fishing backwards for rationalizations for things they already believe. Of course, Christians may dismiss that analogy on the grounds that it's just hypothetical. But the fact is that Christians are confronted with similar conundrums, even if not as neatly analogous as the fake Himalayan one. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known work of epic literature. It unquestionably came before the Bible, and by all appearances it inspired many biblical tales, especially Noah's flood. So what do Christians take from this? Being sticklers for textual evidence, do they conclude that Gilgamesh is more reliable than the Bible because its documents trace back closer to the time of the claimed events? Of course not. They either deny the obvious evidence about the document's age, or just assert that the Sumerians, because they were the first to invent writing, recorded a false story before the Hebrews could record the true story. In short, Christians will only come to one of two conclusions about the Bible. Either it's true because it's well supported by textual evidence, or it's true in spite of the fact that it's not supported by textual evidence. And this is the crux of the whole issue. This is not about coming to believe in something because of evidence, nor has it ever been. It's about cobbling together half-baked and ill-informed justifications for continuing to believe whatever you learned in Sunday school. That's all. Regardless of how many biblical texts we have, or how early they date, this argument is a non-starter. Now, for those of you wondering how much longer I'm going to keep this shit up, there are only going to be 2 more videos in this series. Next week, I'm going to address the comparison between textual evidence for Caesar and textual evidence for Christ. After that, Voddie's presentation breaks down into strawman conspiracy theories and other miscellaneous nonsense, so my final video will just be blowing through that in more of a traditional response style. I'm also making progress in my next cartoon, which will be about Cain and Abel, so don't worry your little heads over that.